Welcome back. We're now going to spend some time talking about criminalization and policing. Before we get started, I want to state that I know this is a highly charged topic at the moment. We've talked about how certain issues have been used as wedges to divide us, and this is one of those issues at the moment. We've seen the narrative spring up, pitting Black Lives Matter against the reactive Back the Blue movement, and emotions have been high on both sides. We're going to try and focus on history and data right now and see what that shows us. First, some background. One of the biggest changes in how law enforcement functions is the creation of the War on Drugs. This program was initially started by Nixon in the 1970s, ostensibly to quote-unquote crack down on crime, although his advisors later admitted that the actual motivation was a way to go after the anti-war and Black Power movements that were causing him political problems. The War on Drugs was escalated and expanded by Reagan in the 1980s. Some of the strategies included targeting particular neighborhoods, heavy mandatory minimum sentences for even low-level drug-related offenses, and a shift in policing to using more military-style gear and tactics. This latter was encouraged by the federal government, who offered military surplus to police departments at reduced rates and offered grant funding to help pay for the equipment. We also have to recognize the biases inherent in police and their choices in training. Police are Americans, and just like all Americans, are subject to the same unconscious biases as all Americans around dominant and marginalized identities. This is widely recognized by most experts in policing, and the majority of police departments try to offset this with implicit bias training. However, time devoted to implicit bias training is significantly less than other forms of training, and there's been little data collection done to determine the effectiveness of this training. At the same time, the shift in policing strategies and increased militarization caused by the war on drugs has made encounters with the police more dangerous to civilians. Let's start looking at some of the data regarding arrests. We're going to look primarily at the New York Police Department Stop and Frisk program, because there's solid, well-published data on that program, which isn't always the case. Here, we can see the racial breakdown of the Stop and Frisk program in New York City. Stop and Frisk was a program run by the NYPD that temporarily detained, questioned, and searched people if the officers thought they seemed suspicious. It's very clear that more than half the stops every year were Black New Yorkers. At least another 25% were Latinx people. For comparison, New York City is about 42% white, 24% Black, 29% Latinx, and 14% Asian. Narrowing it down a bit to just men between the ages of 14 and 24, you can see that about 25% of the stops were young Black men, 13% were young Latinos, and 4% were young white men. This equates to nearly half of all total stop and frisk encounters. Stop and frisk was considered pretty controversial, and several lawsuits resulted in a requirement in 2013 that police must have a thoroughly documented reason to stop and frisk a civilian. This led to a severe drop in the number of stop and frisk encounters. This gives us an opportunity to look at the effectiveness of stop and frisk on the overall crime rate. If it was an effective strategy, we should see crime rates rise because fewer criminals were being stopped preemptively. If it wasn't effective, we should see that the crime rate wasn't effective. So let's look at those crime rates. The top chart compares murder rates over time, the pink line, to stop and frisk encounters over time, the red line. You can see in 2013 how the red line drops dramatically. At the same point in time, the pink line remains level. The rate of murders did not increase with the reduction of stop and frisk encounters. The second chart compares the stop and frisk rate, the dark red line, with the rates of property crime, the light red line, and violent property crime, the pink line. Again, in 2013, you can see the drop-off in stop and frisk encounters. At the same time, both property crime and violent crime rates seem about the same, even dropping off slightly. These two charts suggest that while stop and frisk may have sounded like a common sense approach to crime prevention, it didn't really turn out to be an effective strategy. While at the same time putting a lot of Black and Latinx New Yorkers through traumatic encounters, they reduced trust in authority figures. This really emphasizes how important data collection is to evaluating policing practices. just because it sounds like it works, even if police leadership insists that it works. Without data, we cannot be sure that policing strategies are, in fact, doing what they intend to do. Let's start looking at one of the other major aspects of criminalization, incarceration. We've already talked about how the war on drugs has changed policing tactics. This chart shows a bit about how the war on drugs has changed how many people are in prison at any one time. You can see here that after Nixon initiated the war on drugs, there was a modest uptick in the number of people incarcerated. However, after Reagan's 1984 Sentencing Reform Act, which created harsh mandatory minimum sentences for people convicted on drug-related charges, you can see the rate of people incarcerated rises exponentially. This rise in incarceration has made the United States an outlier among similarly advanced countries. An American is 3 times as likely to be in prison than even the second highest country, Chile. We're also an outlier when you look at the entire world. No other country has as high a rate of incarceration as the United States. And this rate of incarceration is expensive. The money spent on incarceration has increased by 350% since 1980, as adjusted for inflation. The majority of this increased cost has been through local and state funding as well. As a reminder, increases in carceral spending means either higher taxes or lower expenditures in other areas, such as infrastructure and education. Of course, there are other costs. The people in prison aren't there to be part of their families and to contribute to the well-being of their families. They aren't working, aren't adding to the economy, and aren't supporting their families. Instead, their families are often spending money to support their loved ones in prison. The Prison Policy Initiative estimates that almost $3 billion a year is spent by families for things like commissary funds, phone calls, and email access for prisoners. So, who is sitting in prison? Now, we know the rates of drug use for Black and white Americans is pretty consistent. About 10% of the population uses illicit drugs. However, the rate of arrest for illicit drug use is staggeringly different. Black Americans are more than twice as likely to be arrested for illicit drug use than white Americans. This is reflected in the racial disparities in prison, as illustrated by this chart. On the left, you see the racial breakdown by percentage of the U.S. population. White people make up about 64% of the U.S. population, Latinx people about 16%, Black people 13%, and Natives just under 1%. On the right, you see the racial breakdown by percentage of the incarcerated population in the United States. Latinx and Native people are about on par for their overall percentage of population. However, white people are significantly less represented, while Black people are significantly overrepresented. Length of prison terms show the racial disparities as well. If you look just at those most likely to spend their entire lives in prison, it becomes quite clear that those with black or brown skin are more likely to receive life or multiple life sentences. For all men imprisoned, 1 in 9 will spend the rest of their lives in prison. If that person is white, the odds drop to 1 in 17. If that person is Latino, it's 1 in 6. However, if that person is Black, there's a 1 in 3 chance that they will not be released from prison. The odds are similar for women. It's fairly clear that women are less likely to be given life sentences, as we can see that only 1 in 56 women in prison will be there for life. The odds drop in half if the woman in question is white. If the woman is Black, however, she is about 3 times more likely to never be released. This ratio of disparity is about even for race, if not by gender. In her widely acclaimed and seminal book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander argues that the war on drugs is effectively a war on Black people in the United States, that drug surveillance, arrests, and incarcerations have taken the place of the Jim Crow laws that existed prior to the Civil Rights Movement, just as the Jim Crow laws were designed to replace the social controls of slavery. It's definitely clear from the data that Black people are far more likely to be targeted, arrested, and imprisoned for significant periods on drug-related charges than any other race. even while we know drug usage rates are similar, and more white men are selling drugs than other races. This is exacerbated by the discretion police are given, particularly with regard to drug enforcement, and the difficulty in proving racial discrimination because the legal bar for individual acts of discrimination is very high. Alexander also talks about the school-to-prison pipeline and how that has increased incarceration. The school-to-prison pipeline is a shorthand way of talking about how a number of factors, such as increased numbers of police and surveillance at schools, higher rates of zero-tolerance policies, suspensions and expulsions, cutbacks to education support for students, and increased reliance on high-pressure environments brought on by high-stakes testing, increased privatization, and school closures. All of these, combined with the biases against marginalized identities, has meant more children of color, children with disabilities, children in foster care, and LGBTQ+ children are being pushed out of classrooms and are more likely to interact with the criminal justice system than straight white, non-disabled children. For example, while Black students make up only about 14% of the overall student population, they make up 40% of the students who are expelled from school, a number identical to the percentage of Black folks related to all incarcerated people, so even rates. 70% of all students who are arrested by school resource officers are Black or Latinx. Other studies have shown teachers are more likely to reprimand Black students for unruly behavior, particularly Black boys, and they are more often likely to send those children to others for disciplinary action rather than handling the problem in the classroom. That bias is what contributes to the increased rates of suspensions, expulsions, and arrests. Similar studies have found increased rates of discipline in the same pattern for students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and students in the foster care system. When a student has more than one of these identities, like being Black and disabled, their chances of facing suspension or expulsion increase dramatically. While many of the measures put in place were done to help keep schools safe from drugs and violence, particularly as the war on drugs ramped up, there's conflicting evidence to support whether these measures actually change rates of violence and drug use. We do know that more marginalized students are being pushed out of school and into the criminal justice system, though, which begs the question, whose safety is being considered? Overall, it does not look like the war on drugs has been a success. The U.S. has poured money into programs that were supposed to fight drug abuse and deal harshly with people involved in illicit drugs, but the rate of actual addiction has never changed during that period. At the same time, we know enforcement and punishment has been unevenly applied, particularly to Black Americans, while we spend even more money incarcerating people. I've used the war on drugs as an example, but we see racial, gender, and disability discrepancies throughout the criminal justice system. Many high-level police officers and criminal justice researchers are in agreement that those disparities exist as outcome. What we don't understand very well is what exactly is allowing those disparities to occur in a system that is supposed to mete out equal justice. There are hints of it, such as understanding that implicit bias affects everything, including police decisions. But we do not know what can compensate for that. Every few years, there's a new call for some sort of police reform, from community policing to hiring more officers of color to increased implicit bias training. Many of these reforms have been implemented to various degrees, but with little hard evidence to show whether they've made a difference, particularly on a larger scale. What we truly need is standardized data from around the country. At this point, there are widely varying requirements for what sort of data police collect, whom they share that data with, and who cannot access that data. We need broad, rich data sets to begin to understand what sort of factors contribute to the uneven application of justice. We also need to shift how criminal justice research works. Too often, research grants are awarded to police departments themselves, rather than independent researchers. Just like we can't have good medical research funded by pharmaceutical companies, we cannot have good criminal justice research if researchers feel they must supply favorable answers to those paying for the research. In the meantime, we need to push for a culture of more transparency on police actions and judicial decisions, and more independent review of policing, the judiciary, and public policy. All of this will allow us to see what is actually happening with police on the ground and find solutions grounded in data to mitigate these disparities.